winter gale howled like a wounded beast through the bamboo groves of the northern highlands. But for Jame, the loudest noise was the violent thumping of his own heart against his ribs. It was lunar New Year's Eve, a time meant for sacred reunions, yet all he felt was the terrifying shadow of an eternal separation. In his dirt-stained hand, he held the weight of 1,000 sins, the official white envelope from the city's leading clinical laboratory. The paper was cold, damp from the pervasive mist, and felt like a jagged shard of broken glass against his calloused palm. This wasn't just a medical report, it was a verdict on his very soul. James' forearm, slicked with a mixture of frigid rain and the dark, viscous mud of the field, tightened with a primal force that made his muscles ripple like taut cables. The veins in his neck popped, straining under the pressure of a truth he was too terrified to acknowledge. With a sudden, guttural growl that was swallowed by the shrieking wind, he crushed the envelope into a shapeless mass. His powerful, filth-encrusted fingers dug into the paper until it was a mangled, mud-splattered wad. The bold letters, DNA result, and the sterile laboratory logo were slowly obscured by the grit under his fingernails. To the world, this paper defined legality. To Jame, it was the death warrant of the only happiness he had ever found. He didn't need a series of genetic markers to tell him who Diep was. He knew her through the shared, agonizing rhythm of their survival, through the scars on their hands that mirrored one another like ancient maps of pain. He refused to let his father's sordid past, or the ghost of the woman named Tu, become the architect of his destruction. He wouldn't allow a sterile machine in a distant city to dictate the blood that flowed through his heart or the destiny he had carved from the mud. James' heavy leather boots sank deep into the mire as he moved toward the edge of their small garden, the suction of the earth pulling at him like the secrets he tried so desperately to leave behind. Every step was a physical battle against the planet itself, a man struggling to stay upright as the foundations of his reality crumbled. He stopped and looked over at Diep. She was a silhouette of noble endurance, her pale face illuminated only by the dying, orange embers of their small yard fire. She was kneeling, her knees soaked through her thin clothes by the freezing slurry of the garden bed, her slender fingers delicately but firmly pressing seeds into the dark dirt. For her, the new year was a promise of growth and life. For him, it was a countdown to a nightmare. The conflict in James' eyes burned with a ferocity that eclipsed the cold, overcast winter sky. If the truth was a poison intended to kill their future, he would be the one to swallow it whole and burn in the aftermath. He lunged toward the bonfire, his muscular frame casting a long, jagged shadow over the mud like a predatory ghost. Without a single moment of hesitation, he cast the crushed, mud-stained envelope into the heart of the flames. He stood motionless, watching as the hungry orange fire licked the paper, the laboratory logo curling into a blackened, unrecognizable husk. The red confidential stamp vanished into gray ash, fluttering away into the darkness like a dead moth. He felt a fleeting, bitter sense of victory, a sacred lie born from the literal ashes of his father's cruelty. He was protecting her. He was building a wall of smoke and fire to shield Diep from a truth that would shatter her fragile spirit. But as the paper vanished, the weight in his chest only grew heavier, a physical pressure that made every breath a struggle. He had traded his integrity for her peace, and the price was a loneliness he would carry to his grave. "Jame, what are you doing?" Diep's voice, soft and trembling like a wind chime, broke the silence. He didn't look back at the fire. Instead, he stepped toward her, his heavy boots sinking deep into the mud. He reached down, his dirt-caked hands grasping a rusted hoe. He didn't answer with words. He answered with the strike of the metal against the frozen ground. Thud, thud. Each blow was a vow. He was bearing the CEO, bearing the air, and bearing the sun. He was becoming the shield. He swung the hoe with a primal fury, sweat spraying from his forehead into the mud below. He wasn't just tilling the land. He was tilling a new destiny where no father could reach them. The physical pain in his back was a welcome distraction from the soul-wrenching agony in his chest. He would plow until his hands bled, until his bones ached, because as long as he was laboring, he didn't have to face the ghost of the woman named Dieu. He was a man of the earth now, and the earth didn't care about lineage. It only cared about the hands that tended it. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, leaving behind a world choked by a thick, freezing mist that swallowed their small cottage. Inside the shack, the orange glow of the wood fire flickered against the damp, mud-caked walls, a fragile sanctuary built on the ruins of a billionaire's empire. Jame dropped the rusted hoe, the heavy iron blade sinking into the sludge with a final, wet thud. He wiped his forehead with a muddy sleeve, smearing black grit across his brow, his eyes still burning from the smoke of the burned DNA secret. His chest heaved in the darkness, the mist clinging to his damp skin like a suffocating shroud. He loped toward the shack, his heavy boots dragging through the mire, and snatched a handful of dry kindling, tossing it into the dying fire with a violent flick of his wrist. James sat on a low wooden stool, his broad shoulders slumped from the crushing weight of the day's labor and the secret he had just turned to ash. His hands, raw and stained with the red earth of the fields, reached out to the flames, the heat stinging the fresh blisters on his palms. Across from him, Diep was stirring a thin pot of soup, her movements slow and mechanical. The firelight danced in the unshed tears of her eyes, casting long, haunting shadows across her pale, noble face. Jame reached over, his rough fingers brushing a smudge of soot from Diep's cheek, a silent promise to protect this peace, even if it meant living a holy lie. He stood up abruptly to grab a heavy ceramic bowl, pouring water with a shaky hand to hide the tremor in his fingers. The silence of the rural night was a heavy, suffocating blanket, broken only by the crackle of the fire. James stared into the embers, seeing the blackened remains of the DNA result envelope dancing in the heat. He thought of his mother, the woman named Dieu who had vanished into the shadows of his father's past, and the terrifying possibility that the woman he worshipped across the fire shared his own blood. He had renounced his fortune for this tuplu, choosing the mud over the silk, but he hadn't prepared for a truth that could turn his sacrifice into a sin. He gripped the edge of the wooden table until the old timber groaned, his knuckles turning bone white as he fought the urge to scream at the sky. But the peace was an illusion. A sudden, sharp, metallic click echoed from the darkness outside, followed by the heavy, rhythmic crunch of expensive leather boots on the gravel path. James' body went rigid, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron machete leaning against the wall. He stood up, shielding Diep with his massive frame, as a tall, imposing figure emerged from the white void of the mist. Mr. Hoan stood at the threshold, his luxury black coat draped over his shoulders like a shroud, a vulture of the high finance world invading their humble haven. James stepped forward, his boots crushing a dry branch with a sharp snap, his eyes fixing on his father with a predatory intensity. Mr. Juan's eyes, cold and calculating, didn't look at his son. They were fixed solely on Diep, who had frozen like a deer in the headlights. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the ragged breath of a girl who felt her past catching up to her. "I didn't come for you, James." Mr. Hoan's voice was a low growl that vibrated with suppressed rage and a terrifying sense of possession. He pointed a gloved finger at Diep, his face twisting into a mask of arrogant authority. The same man who had once sent an insulting dowry to break their spirit. He stepped into the room, his polished boots a cruel insult to the dirt floor, and slammed a heavy leather briefcase onto the fragile wooden table. "I came for what is mine," Mr. Hoan continued, the words dropping like lead weights into the silence. I came to take back the child I lost to a common peasant 25 years ago. Deep spoon clattered to the floor, the sound ringing like a death knell in the small room, her world shattered by a single sentence. Jame felt the ghost of the burned DNA report screaming in his head, the blood in his veins turning to ice as the nightmare became flesh. Jame lunged forward, grabbing his father's lapel with a muddy hand, the fabric of the expensive suit bunching under his grip as he roared a silent defiance into the old man's face. Mr. Hon didn't flinch, his eyes remaining fixed on Diep, who was now trembling uncontrollably. He opened the briefcase, pulling out a faded photograph of a woman, Dieu, looking exactly like Diep did now. The fire sputtered and died, leaving them all in the suffocating embrace of the mist and the darkness of a father's sins. James shoved his father back toward the door, his muscles straining as he forced the man who created him out of the sanctuary he had built with his own sweat.
Giao thừa lạnh giá mang đến cho Jame một bí mật kinh hoàng khi anh nhận được kết quả DNA có thể phá hủy mối quan hệ giữa anh và Diệp. Không chấp nhận để quá khứ tội lỗi của cha định đoạt tương lai, anh lặng lẽ đốt lá thư, chọn bảo vệ tình yêu bằng sự im lặng và đau đớn. Trong khi Diệp vô tư gieo hy vọng cho năm mới, Jame âm thầm chôn vùi sự thật, lao vào lao động đi cách trốn tránh nỗi dằn vặt. Nhưng sự bình yên mong manh nhanh chóng bị phá vỡ khi ông Hoàng xuất hiện. Mang theo lời tuyên bố chấn động, Diệp chính là đứa con thất lạc của ông. Khoảnh khắc ấy khiến mọi hy sinh của Jame đứng trước nguy cơ trở thành bi kịch, khi quá khứ bị trôn giấu trỗi dậy đe dọa phá nát tương lai họ đang cố gắng xây dựng.